Good evening, everyone. I'm Tracy Glab, Executive Director of the FIA, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Kamaradi Family Lecture. Tonight, we have Dr. Katherine Kasdorf presenting Sculptural Abundance and Visual Prestige, Hoysala Temples in Karnataka, India. My apologies. The Kamaradi Family Lecture Series focuses on topics related to art, history, and the culture of South Asia, and is sponsored by JRC and Dr. Prasad Kamaradi. Let's give them a round of applause for their generous support. Before I introduce our guest, I'd like to thank the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation for their continued support, which is so deeply appreciated and vital to the FIA. I want to thank the citizens of Genesee County for demonstrating their support of the FIA by means of the Genesee County Arts, Education, and Cultural Enrichment Millage, which also provides free entry to the FIA for Genesee County citizens 7 days a week. And a big thank you to Huntington Bank for sponsoring Huntington Free Saturdays, which allows everyone beyond our county free entry on Saturdays. Last but not least, thank you to the Ford Foundation Equity Fund of the Community Foundation of Greater Flint for making the ASL interpretation possible tonight. So let's give a round of applause for all of the generous, including yourselves if you are a resident of Genesee County. I want to remind you that the 14th annual Art on Tap beer, bourbon, barbecue event is coming up on October 13th. Details can be found and tickets can be purchased at our website. I hope to see you there. It's a really fun fall event. Now, please take a moment to silence your cell phones. Dr. Katherine Kasdorf is Associate Curator of Arts of Asia and the Islamic World at the Detroit Institute of Arts. This is her second appearance at the Flint Institute of Arts. We're welcome to have her back. Curatorial projects include new permanent collection galleries at the DIA and the Walters Art Museum, where she previously held a Mellon Postdoctoral Curatorial Fellowship. Dr. Kasdorf has published articles on South Asian temple sculpture and architecture, and on architectural reuse in Hindu and Islamic contexts, among other subjects. She received her PhD in South Asian art history from Columbia University. Please join me in a warm Flint welcome for Dr. Katherine Kasdorf.
Thank you, Tracy, for that very generous introduction, and it's great to be back here at the Flint Institute of Arts. Thanks to all of you for being here, and I'd also like to thank everyone at the FIA who contributed to the logistics of this evening's lecture, including Sarah Cohn, Emily Legleitner, Craig Finner, and so many others. I can't name you all, so thank you. And of course, special thanks to Jay Komareddy for inviting me to speak this evening, and to both Jay and Prasad for sponsoring this wonderful lecture series in South Asian art. I've enjoyed attending every Komareddy family lecture so far, and it's an honor to be participating as a speaker, so thank you. When Jay and I spoke about a possible lecture topic a few months ago, we landed on Hoysala temples, which were the focus of my PhD research. I therefore won't be speaking about the DIA's collection this evening, but I encourage all of you to visit the DIA's Vatikuti Family Gallery of Indian and Southeast Asian art, where you can see Hindu and Jain sculpture from other regions. And as it happens, this Hoysala topic was very auspicious because just this past Monday, 3 Hoysala temple sites have been declared UNESCO World Heritage Sites. So it's a very exciting time for Hoysala temples. So without further ado, yes, this is my first slide. So in the southern Indian state of Karnataka, just a few hours west of the technology capital of Bangalore and a few hours north of the former royal capital, Mysore, are some of the most lavishly sculptural temples in South Asia. built in the 12th and 13th centuries when the Hoysala dynasty ruled the region, they are not as well known as the nearly contemporary, just slightly earlier, Chola temples of the neighboring Tamil Nadu state, or the famous temples at Khajuraho in the north, and many travelers to India miss them, though that might be changing now that some of them are UNESCO World Heritage Sites. So whereas Chola temples are often held up as representing a certain South Indian temple type, and the temples of Khajuraho are said to exemplify a certain North Indian temple type, the most distinctive Hoysala temples are not easily classifiable as either. So this evening, I want to take you through some of the most spectacularly sculptural temples of the Hoysala kingdom, looking both at their artistic forms and at textual inscriptions associated with them. We'll consider how Hoysala period individuals engaged with and visually experienced these buildings. Ultimately, the purpose of the temples we'll be discussing was to serve the Hindu and Jain communities and divinities for whom they were built. But temples have many points of meaning beyond their religious function. And during the Hoysala period, they brought prestige to their patrons and to the kingdom. Some were even built explicitly to make a political statement, as we'll see. And then, as now, temples offered many types of visual experience, including both devotional and aesthetic. Now, of course, not everybody would have experienced temples in the same way. Social class and status might have impacted access to some temples, and subjective experience is always a factor. For anyone encountering them, however, these monumental stone buildings would have been impossible to overlook. So to this end, I'm interested in thinking about how these temples contributed to the visual experience of their locations and how they functioned as urban monuments, bringing prestige and distinction to their cities and towns. But first, before delving into the distinctive forms of Hoysala style and Hoysala period temples, and thinking about their historical reception, let's lay a little groundwork. The Hoysalas were a royal family who held political power in southern Karnataka and neighboring regions from about 1000 to 1346 CE. That's the Common Era, the same as AD. They started out as subordinates to another royal dynasty called the Chalukyas, who were based in northern Karnataka and claimed control over much of the Deccan Plateau in peninsular India between the late 10th and late 12th centuries. And those of you who attended last spring's Komareddy family lecture might remember that Deborah Hutton spoke about the Deccan too, though her focus was a few centuries later on the Bijapur Sultanate. So the Hoysala kingdom was based in the southern part of the Deccan, and its primary capital was the city of Dora Samudra, now a village called Halebidu. And in fact, Halebidu means old capital in Kannada, the language most commonly spoken in Karnataka. Now, another prominent Hoysala city was Belur, just 15 kilometers southwest of Halebidu, and it too briefly served as a royal capital in the early 12th century. Now, two of the earliest and most monumental Hoysala-style temples are located in these towns. The Belur Chainakeshava temple, dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu, was sponsored by the Hoysala king Vishnuvardhana and consecrated in 1117 CE. Keshava, by the way, is one name for Vishnu, and Chaina means good or beautiful in the Kannada language. And then in Halebidu, the Hoysaleshvara temple, dedicated to the Hindu god Shiva, was consecrated in 1120. The name Hoysaleshvara means Lord of the Hoysala, Lord Shiva of Hoysala. So its construction was actually sponsored by a wealthy merchant, though the king supported its operations with a generous endowment of land. So it's worth noting that temples in the Hoysala kingdom were built with support from a wide variety of patrons, including merchants, courtiers, and military leaders, as well as members of the royal family. We know this because stone inscriptions carved into walls, pillars, and monumental stelae record details related to the establishment of temples, as well as details related to later donations made to them. Scholars have read, translated, and published thousands of these inscriptions, and they're a wonderful resource. Most Hoysala inscriptions are in the local Kannada language, but some also include Sanskrit, a pan-Indian language that is central to many Hindu texts and practices, and which was also an important language of the literary and political elite in pre-modern India. So compared to European languages, Sanskrit is analogous to Latin and Kannada is a vernacular. So whatever the language and whoever the patron was, inscriptions that record the foundation of temples or major donations to them praise the ruling king and his dynasty, often in lengthy poetic texts called prashastis. So in this way, these temples became indelibly associated with the Hoysala name, even if their patron was not a member of the Hoysala family. Now, temple inscriptions praise deities too. After all, the raison d'etre of a temple is to enshrine a god, goddess, or other divine being, and to serve as a place of devotion for believers. In Hindu temples, there are usually small shrines for many gods and goddesses of the Hindu pantheon, and many gods and goddesses might be represented on exterior walls, but one deity enshrined at the center in the main sanctum is considered supreme at that temple. The temple is considered to be the home or palace of that deity. So for instance, the foundation inscription of the Hoysaleshvara temple calls the building a mountain-like expansive house of Shiva. And similarly, the temple at Belur would have been considered the house of Vishnu. Now, when worshiping a Hindu god or goddess, believers make offerings of pleasing things like flowers, fruit, oblations, incense, light from lamps, words of praise, music, and sometimes dance by presenting these things to the physical image of the god or goddess. Adorning the image with flowers, powders, clothing, or jewelry is another way to show one's devotion to the deity. In the Belur Chanakeshava temple, the main image is a spectacularly carved sculpture more than 7 feet in height representing the god Vishnu. But devotional images can also be more humble than this. What's important is that the presence of the god himself or the goddess herself is believed to reside within that physical image during the time of worship. So in directing praise or offerings toward the image, believers are not worshiping a sculpture. Rather, they're worshiping and making offerings very directly to the god or goddess that the image embodies. Now, Hindu worship can take place just about anywhere, in the home, in nature, in processional festivals, as well as in temples, but temples most conspicuously mark the dwelling place of a god or goddess. In many Hindu temples, only priests may enter the sacred and powerful space of the sanctum, which the deity inhabits, so lay devotees stand in the adjacent space, usually a pillared hall, and look on as the priest brings their offerings to the god, performs oblations, and chants verses of praise in Sanskrit, and you can see that in this photo. The act of seeing the deity, called darshan, is a central part of worship, providing a direct connection to the god or goddess. So because the deity is present within the devotional image, when you look at the image during the time of worship, you're looking at the god himself or at the goddess herself. And not only that, the god or goddess is also looking at you. The gaze is reciprocal. And just to point out, when I took this photo, large reflective eyes had been placed over Vishnu's face to make his eyes bigger and more easy to see from afar to facilitate darshan. If the hall was crowded and people had to stand back, you can still see his eyes. And also notice Vishnu here is dressed in beautiful clothing and jewelry, as devotional images very often are. Now, many Hoysala period temples are dedicated to Hindu deities, primarily to the gods Shiva or Vishnu, though other gods and goddesses have a presence in their temples too. But Jain communities also thrived in the Hoysala kingdom, and Jain temples form a prominent part of the landscape. In the Jain religion, believers revere 24 idealized omniscient beings called jinnas. Jinnas exemplify perfect virtue, and they teach other beings the path toward a virtuous life. The word jinna actually means victor, because jinnas are believed to have conquered all attachments to worldly existence through meditation and strict self-discipline and living a virtuous life. So as spiritually liberated beings, they're no longer in the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Jinas are not present within their images in the same way that Hindu deities are. But still, many aspects of Jain worship resemble Hindu worship. So believers praise Jinas and make offerings to them by presenting these things to devotional images. But when directing words of praise toward a Jina image or singing a devotional hymn in its presence, a believer is venerating and meditating on the ideals that the image embodies. And making offerings is not so much about giving pleasing things to the Jina, because after all, the Jina isn't actually there to accept them the way a god or goddess is, but rather, in this case, it's an act of renunciation. It's about giving something up. Now, Jina images are typically, or I guess it's safe to say, always represented in postures of meditation, either seated with crossed legs or standing perfectly straight with arms hanging down to the sides. Because Jinas are believed to have renounced all material comforts during their lifetimes, they are either represented in very simple robes or without any clothing at all. Now, whether or not a Jina is represented with clothing has to do with the sectarian affiliation of the image. So in one Jain community called Shvetambara, or white-clad, monks wear white robes and Jinas are represented in robes too. But in the Hoysala kingdom, Jain temples were affiliated with another monastic community called Digambara, or sky-clad. The most committed Digambara monks renounce clothing, and Jina images are likewise naked. Now, one of my favorite Hoysala inscriptions, and I have many favorites, is from a Jain temple in Halebidu. It records the consecration of the Jina Parshvanatha in 1133 in a new temple built through the patronage of a courtier named Bopadeva. The foundation inscription lauds the artistic beauty of what it calls the Jinalaya, or abode of the Jina, saying that even the god Brahma could not surpass the artistry of its carvings, and that the temple shone like the silver mountain, the famed Kailasa. It goes on to say that this Jinalaya was built, quote, in the middle of the greatest of capital cities, Dora Samudra, end quote. And remember, that's the Hoysala period name for Halebidu. And then it states the date and other details related to the consecration. While the temple's exterior is elegant but understated, its interior boasts intricately carved pillars, ceilings, and subsidiary shrines, the shrines which once housed all 24 Jinas. The image of Parshvanatha, the Jina Parshvanatha, is more than 14 feet tall, much larger than most devotional sculptures, and the Jina's austere body is framed by an elaborate sculptural backdrop. Standing inside the temple, it is easy to understand the inscription's boast that even Brahma, the creator god, could not surpass the fine work of the building. And as a side note, I think that this temple, with its colossal devotional image, would have brought prestige to Dora Samudra, but I don't have time to discuss this in detail tonight. That can be another lecture. Now, historians of the Hoysala kingdom and its temples have long cited Bopadeva's inscription for the information that it provides about the Parshvanatha temple's date and patron, but I find its references to the building's artistic details and location within the capital city much more interesting. The inscription's dual emphasis in a single sentence, in fact, on the temple's visual splendor and urban setting suggests that Bopadeva and his contemporaries drew a connection between the two. Oh, okay, good. Got worried there for a second. So with this in mind, I would like to return to Halebidu's most famous temple, the Hoysaleshvara, and explore how its profusely sculptural design brought prestige and distinction to the Hoysala capital. But in order to do this, in order to understand this, we'll need to consider its position within the city of Dora Samudra, within its broader urban landscape, and see how its sculptural and architectural forms compare to other temples. So today, the Hoysaleshvara temple stands amidst manicured lawns maintained by the Archaeological Survey of India, and there's a site museum directly to the north. During the Hoysala period, though, its surroundings would have been vastly different. Although many of the buildings that once stood in the Hoysala capital no longer exist, surviving temples and temple ruins, traces of the city's fort wall, and fragmentary foundations that have been identified with the Hoysala palace provide some idea of the city's layout. Also important are the water reservoirs that surround the city. And in fact, the earliest surviving Hoysala inscription from Dora-Samudra, dating to 1062 or 3, records construction related to these reservoirs. The remnants of the fort wall encircle an irregularly shaped area that spans just over 2 kilometers at its widest points. Much of this area is agricultural today, but during the city's time as a royal capital between the mid-11th and mid-14th centuries, we can imagine that many of today's fields would have been populated by the city's residents. And while buildings made of perishable materials must once have stood throughout Dora-Samudra, the concentration of stone temples and ruins in the eastern part of the fortified area suggests that this was a particularly active zone. And the southeastern quadrant, which you can see in this map right around here, seems to have been particularly the most prominent of all because the palace and the largest stone temples were located in that area. Now, within this eastern zone of the city, a significant number of temples and ruins are situated along a particular north-south axis. It angles toward the west a little bit in the north. It's very likely that this axis marks the location of a major road, which during the Hoysala period was lined with many of the city's most prominent buildings. And today, a modern road runs along this very route. In addition to being a focus for urban growth, this thoroughfare must have been at the center of urban life in the Hoysala capital, a site of social and commercial interaction, as well as a route traveled by both residents and visitors wishing to get from point A to point B. Not all the temples that lined this road were there from the beginning, of course. Each new construction would have altered the character of the city, contributing to people's visual experience of the capital in new ways. The Hoysaleshvara temple is one of the earliest surviving temples to have been built in Dora-Samudra. Its foundation inscription, which dates to the year 1120 CE, tells us that a merchant named Ketamala sponsored its construction and named it in honor of the king, Vishnuvardhana Hoysala. So, as I mentioned before, the name Hoysaleshvara translates to Lord of Hoysala. So, as a particularly monumental temple and one bearing the royal family's name, the Hoysaleshvara occupied a prime place at the very center of the city's urbanized eastern zone, on the eastern side of that main road, and at a midpoint between the northern and southern fort walls. This north-south road also directly connected the Hoysaleshvara temple to the palace, which was located just a short distance to the southwest. And a gateway in the eastern fort wall of the city suggests that another road would have run east-west just north of the temple. So the Hoysaleshvara temple then was at a point of convergence for different sectors of Dora-Samudra's population and for visitors entering the city from multiple directions. As people traveled along the roads running alongside the temple, they could not have missed this prominent building. They would have seen the temple, whether or not it was their destination. And its radically sculptural exterior and distinctive double plan, I want to argue, made it a monument for Dora-Samudra, noticed and remembered by those who saw it and associated specifically with the city, because such a temple existed absolutely nowhere else. So the Hoysaleshvara temple was actually designed as 2 temples standing side by side. I'm showing you a ground plan here. Typically, a temple would be sort of just this one half, but the Hoysaleshvara is 2 giant temples with a common hall joining them together. Directly to the east of the, and both sanctums of the temple, so these are, on the architectural plan, this is the most holy part of each side. They both enshrine icons of the god Shiva known as lingas. Directly east of the enclosed temple, open pavilions enshrining Shiva's bull Nandi face each linga. Now, every major Hindu god and goddess has an animal vehicle who is also that deity's devotee, and Nandi the bull is Shiva's. Now, behind the southern of the Nandi mandapas, Nandi pavilions, is a shrine to the sun god Surya, who also faces the southern linga in reverence. Now, while the temple itself faces east, you can see the eastern side on the bottom here. The western side, which you see at the top, is the side that faces that major road that I was just talking about. And it is the building's Western walls that feature that dynamic sculptural style that would come to be associated with the Hoysala dynasty, but which first seems to have been associated with their capital city. Considered one variety of what is now known as the Hoysala style, a temple style with much variation, but which always features prominent figural imagery on the exterior walls, this profusely sculptural design was first seen on the Hoysaleshvara temple. The Chainakeshava temple in Belur, which predates the Hoysaleshvara by just a few years, is also described as Hoysala style today, and it similarly features dynamically carved figures on the exterior walls. Both temples were also built of schist, a relatively soft, fine-grained stone that facilitates that detailed carving that we see in these Hoysala temples. But as you can see from this comparison, the elevation and overall visual effect of the Belur and Halebidu temples are quite different. The Hoysaleshvara temple's walls are almost completely covered in sculpture, whereas the Chainakeshava temple's walls retain more plain, uncarved surfaces. Now, while the Hoysaleshvara temple's design would later be imitated elsewhere, no temple matches its scale and sculptural dynamism. The ground plan contributes to this effect. Each side of the double temple follows a radial, multi-pointed outline that is often described as stellate or star-shaped. Not only is the shape itself sculptural and dynamic, it also multiplies the number of surfaces of wall on the outside available to be carved. And no surface is left uncarved. At the base of the walls, 8 sculptural friezes wrap their way around the entire building. They display processions of elephants and horses, narrative scenes of ancient epics and stories about the gods, and other imagery such as geese and mythical aquatic animals called makaras. Above the friezes is a succession of large figural images carved into blocks more than 5 feet in height. They represent Hindu gods and goddesses, divine musicians and dancers, and other celestial beings. While the temple is dedicated to Shiva, multitudes of gods and goddesses from the Hindu pantheon find a place on these walls, including many forms of both Shiva and Vishnu, and many goddesses. And then along the top, separated from the figures by an overhanging eave, are schematic images of temple towers on pillars, arranged as if to enshrine the deities below. Now today, this upper level of wall is not far from the temple's roofline, but in all likelihood, the building originally would have supported 2 towers. They were probably constructed out of brick, wood, and stucco, materials that are less durable than stone. These towers probably looked something like the towers of later temples built after the model of the Hoysaleshvara temple, such as those of the Keshava temple in Somnathpur. When they were intact, they would have created a distinctive double-peaked roofline that must have been a defining feature of the city, visible from afar as travelers approached. Now, when the Hoysaleshvara temple was built, this 3-part design of its walls, the friezes on the bottom, figures in the middle, and schematic tower on pillar motifs at top, this 3-part design was completely new, and the sculptural quality of the building was completely unmatched. Between the friezes running continuously around the temple and the dynamic divinities lining the middle part of the wall, very few flat surfaces remain. The temple's building blocks have themselves become beautiful sculptures. Each figural composition extends into the space of the image carved onto the adjacent face of the block, causing outer corners to dissolve into sculptural forms. So in this example, one face of the block, which you see on the right, represents Varaha, the boar incarnation of the god Vishnu. And then on the adjacent face of the block, we see Garuda, Vishnu's vehicle and loyal devotee who is part man, part eagle. And here, just to explain a little bit more, Varaha tramples a demon that had threatened to drown the earth goddess while holding the earth goddess Bhudevi safely on his shoulder. Now, on the corner, though, where these 2 compositions meet, as you see in the photo in the center, the compositions are just wonderfully meshed together. We see Garuda's elbow alternating with some of Vishnu's hands. We see a demon being hooked by Vishnu's elephant goad, abutting Garuda's bow, and other compositional elements fill in the rest of the space. So multiply this by the dozens of sculptural blocks built into the temple, and the result of this corner technique is a wall that appears as a vast field of sculpture. Imagery extends without interruption across the zigzagging undulations that form the body of the temple, which are angled to enhance the dramatic effects of each day's changing light and shadow on the high relief. Now, whether viewed from the position of the road, where you can see the whole building, or from up close, where just one section of wall is visible, the visual effect is astounding. As you move around the temple, you encounter one spectacular example of artistic virtuosity after another. For example, in this part of the building here on the southern side, there are two especially detailed sculptures of Krishna, a human incarnation of the god Vishnu. As Venugopala, the cowherd with the flute, he's surrounded by dozens of small figures, both human and bovine, all attracted to him and the sound of his music. And in this sculpture, Krishna holds up Mount Govardhana to shelter the residents of his village from the torrential rains of the god Indra. The mountain in the upper register is home to monkeys, birds, multiple types of trees, and even a hunter aiming an arrow at a boar. And then snakes, which are associated with water, emerge from the mountain's base. And below, flanking Krishna, rows of musicians, people with herding canes, and cattle all wait out the storm. Now, these large figural panels are raised some 7.5 feet above the level of the plinth which the temple stands upon, and visitors must look up to see them. But right around eye level, we see that narrative frieze with scenes from the Ramayana and Mahabharata epics, and with scenes from the Bhagavata Purana, which relate stories of the life of the god Krishna. In the detail I'm showing you on the screen from the Mahabharata epic, we see the hero Arjuna at left standing on one foot on top of a mountain as he performs physical austerities in order to gain a powerful weapon from the god Indra. And then at right, we see the next part of the narrative where the god Shiva is in disguise as a hunter, and he and Arjuna fight over a boar that they think they both have the right to shoot. There's more to the story, but I'm going to leave it at that for now. So moving around the temple, there are just endless visual details to enjoy. During the Hoysala period, as today, visitors to the temple must have appreciated it for its beauty, marveling at the artistic skill on display and delighting in the visual representations of familiar stories and beloved deities. Certainly, these individuals also would have visited the temple for worship and darshan, as many still do today, but they would have engaged in multiple activities while they were there. And I would argue that artistic appreciation was one of them. Now, although surviving inscriptions don't explicitly discuss the Hoysaleshvara temple's formal characteristics beyond the damaged foundation inscription's reference statement that it was a mountain-like expansive house of Shiva, other Hoysala period inscriptions have more to say about their temple's artistic merits. We've already seen that the foundation inscription of Dorasamudra's Parshvanatha temple, dating just a few years after the Hoysaleshvara, praises the design and quality of that temple's carvings. And another example is the foundation inscription of the Belur Chanakeshava temple, dated just a few years before the Hoysaleshvara. This text extensively celebrates its temple's artistry, the building's artistry, extending across several lines of text, carved neatly into stone. The architectural panegyric lauds the temple for adhering to the rules of design with grammar-like precision. It marvels at the ivory-like images the building supports. It delights in the stone figures that adorn the structure like digits of the moon, it says. It says the temple is pleasing to the eye as the god Indra, and it poetically praises several other features, including pillars, doorways, and more. Hoysala period individuals noticed and appreciated the visual qualities of their temples. Other inscriptions that attest to the value of the visual arts in Hoysala society include the artist signatures, or at least artist names, that are found in numerous Hoysala period temples. Now, this is far from typical. For most South Asian temple architecture, we know next to nothing about the artists, though artist names are found on some other temples and in some other regions and time periods. But again, throughout the whole subcontinent, they're not the norm. But in Hoysala-style temples, they proliferate. Sometimes an artist's name appears in the margins of a sculptural frieze. Other times it appears in the lower register of a figural block. And some of the most informative artist inscriptions are associated with the bracket figures of the Belur-Chanakeshava temple. 38 of them are found along the eastern side of the building, where pillars are interspersed with stone screens. These bracket figures bridge the space between the pillars and the overhanging eaves of the roof. 4 more are found inside the temple in the hall preceding the sanctum. And popularly known as Madanikai, these bracket figures engage in a range of activities. We see musicians and drummers, dancers, and female figures enjoying leisurely pursuits, such as this woman admiring a pet bird. Each one is carved in intricate detail with elaborate hairstyles, gem-studded jewelry, and spiraling leafy canopies that seem to grow right before our eyes. More than half of Belur's bracket figures bear inscriptions that name the artists who made them. Many of these inscriptions also glorify these sculptors with honorific titles and that sometimes reveal a competitive streak among artists. So for instance, in the base of this female drummer, the sculptor Malayana is called an Indra, that is the king of gods. We've been hearing his name a lot. He's called an Indra to mountains of jealous sculptors, each of whom also has their own honorific titles. And then in this one, this lady, this is a motif that Hoysala artists and artists in other regions like, a lady shooing away a mischievous monkey who's tugging at her clothes and exposing her a little bit. So in this fun sculpture by the sculptor Dasoja, Dasoja is called greatest among crowds of titled sculptors. Now, notably, Dasoja's inscription also tells us that he came from Baligrama, or Baligavi, a town about 200 kilometers north of Belur. Other inscriptions that name Hoysala artists' hometowns reveal that numerous sculptors working in the early 12th century temples at Belur and Halebidu came from locations in the same region as Baligavi, about 150 to 250 kilometers away. In this region, these artists would have worked on temples with walls featuring architectural imagery rather than figural imagery. But the sculptural details of the temple images, as well as the elaborately carved doorways, ceilings, and devotional images, are as intricate as ever. Probably recruited by Hoysala patrons, when they migrated south, these artists brought their knowledge and training with them. Now, artists seem to have migrated to the Hoysala kingdom from even further north as well. Some scholars have noted striking parallels between the figures featured on Hoysala-style temples and those seen on temples built more than 500 kilometers to the north during the late 11th and early 12th centuries. The resemblance is especially striking in the facial features and in decorative details such as jewelry and hairstyle. In this case, we don't have any artist signatures or names to corroborate the connection in writing, but the visual evidence, I think, speaks for itself. Plus, we know that during this period, people traveled between this region and Hoysala country. I mentioned near the beginning of my talk that the Hoysalas were initially subordinate to another dynasty called the Chalukyas. The Chalukya capital, Kalyana, was located in the far north of present-day Karnataka, right where we find these kinds of temples. So it looks like in the second decade, I should just say in the second decade of the 12th century, exactly when the monumental temples at Belur and Halebidu were constructed, the Hoysalas stopped explicitly acknowledging their Chalukya overlords in inscriptions. And this is a big deal because inscriptional records always named the local ruler as well as his superiors. But in the inscriptions at Belur and Halebidu, but these inscriptions make no mention of any ruler superior to the Hoysala king. The omission of the Chalukya king from these inscriptions is quite a statement. Building monumental temples was another way of asserting sovereignty for the emerging, sovereignty and prestige, for the emerging Hoysala state. It required a command over the resources necessary to quarry vast amounts of stone, transport that stone to the desired location, and employ the teams of artists and workers who transformed the raw material into a beautiful building. For their Hoysala patrons, artists sculpted prominent figures that not only emulated those seen on the temples in the territories of the Chalukyas, but surpassed them in sculptural abundance and finesse. Now, both the Hoysaleshvara and Jaina-Keshava temples would have made a strong visual statement, bringing a mark of distinction to their cities, their patrons, and the expanding Hoysala state. In Belur, though, the foundation inscription of the Jaina-Keshava temple explicitly states that the temple was built as an expression of political power. We learn from the text that this temple was directly sponsored by the king, Vishnuvardhana, and that the god was originally called Vijaya Narayana. Now, Narayana is another name for Vishnu. I mentioned before, Keshava is one name for Vishnu. Vishnu has lots of names. Narayana is another. And Vijaya means victory. So it was dedicated to Narayana of victory. And when the king dedicated this temple to Narayana of victory, following an important military victory over the Cholas that expanded the Hoysala territory and boosted their claim to power. The inscription recounts this victory as well as others in poetic hyperbole and specifically states that the king, quote, constructed the lofty and elegant temple of Vijaya Narayana from the wealth acquired through the might of his arms, end quote. Looting the wealth of a conquered enemy was part and parcel of warfare in 12th century India, and it appears that King Vishnuvardhana and his advisors decided to use the assets acquired from their recent victory to build a temple that would forever stand as a reminder of their triumph and strength. The Hoysaleshvara temple was also connected to the dynasty's political ascent. However, its sponsorship by the merchant Ketamala invites us to think about the ways it might have brought prestige to a wider sector of Hoysala society, beyond the ruling elite, beyond the ruling family. The construction of such a monumental temple right at the heart of the Hoysala capital clearly would have enhanced the status of the monarch and his state. But Ketamala also had a stake in that status. As a merchant who worked in the service of the king, his fortunes must have been closely tied to those of his royal employer. Moreover, merchants like Ketamala also played an important role in the Hoysala dynasty's consolidation of political authority, and they seem to have exercised a certain amount of power themselves. Their trans-regional connections gave the territory-based state an upper hand in the import of luxury and military goods, and many merchants rose in the ranks of the Hoysala court. With political and economic power so closely intertwined, the construction of a prominent temple bearing the royal name within the capital city would have been mutually beneficial to the Hoysala state and the merchants it employed. More than this, it is not difficult to imagine that the prestige expressed by the monumental building would have benefited an even larger sector of the population, also including the artists and architects who created the temple, the priests and ritual functionaries employed there, and other participants in Hoysala society. The point that a broader Hoysala society, and not just Hoysala royalty, stood to benefit from the prestige associated with a temple is important to the idea that the Hoysaleshvara temple was an urban monument that brought prestige and distinction to the city as a whole. We've already noted that three-part design of the walls, composed of friezes, large figures, and tower-on-pillar motifs, was completely new when the temple was built, and we've seen the impressive effects of its sculptural walls, both from up close and from afar. It wasn't long before other temples were built after the model, but notably, for a full 100 years, they were all in Dorisamudra too. The abundantly sculptural style that the Hoysaleshvara temple introduced seems to have become an important part of the city's visual identity. So 15 or 20 years after the Hoysaleshvara was constructed, three monumental temples, known collectively today as the Nagareshvara temples, were built in the same style about 200 meters to the west. These temples are now in ruin, but remnants of their sculptural friezes and large figural blocks from the site attest to the similarities that they shared with the Hoysaleshvara. The figural blocks, which are nearly as large as those of the Hoysaleshvara temple, also displayed those sculptural corners. And we can imagine that the temples would have had a similarly sculptural effect, this uninterrupted sculptural wall. Right in the middle of the city, then, there would have been two monumental temples or temple compounds with this type of visually impressive facade. Then later, in the southeastern part of the city, about half a kilometer east of the palace, the Curator temple was built in the same style around the beginning of the 13th century, with patronage directly from the king at the time, Balala II, and one of his queens named Abhinava Ketala Devi. The temple as it stands today is quite different than it would have been then. Photographs from the 19th century show a tree growing out of its tower, and when the building was restored in the early 20th century, sculptural blocks were brought from that Nagareshvara ruin to fill in where the Kedareshvara's own materials were missing. And of course, the tower was never reconstructed. But even though the temple is not exactly as it appeared then, we can still imagine how it would have appeared in the 13th century based on these photographs and on the temple's own original materials. So the figural blocks that are original to the Kedareshvara temple have bases with horizontal moldings, some of them with foliate motifs, whereas those from the Nagareshvara ruin have bases with scrolling vines. And looking at the Kedareshvara's own sculptural blocks, we see crisp corners separate one figural composition from the next. The Kedareshvara may have strengthened the association of this ornate temple style with the Hoysala capital then, but its overall visual effect was not quite the same as the temples at the heart of the city. By now, I imagine that some of you are wondering about temples in other Hoysala towns and cities. Hundreds of temples were built throughout the Hoysala kingdom in a variety of architectural styles. Some have relatively plain exteriors, others display images of temple towers in lieu of figural images, and still others feature that prominent figural imagery. It's that third category with the figures that we call Hoysala style today. There's still quite a bit of formal variation among Hoysala style temples, there's still quite a bit of formal variation among Hoysala-style temples, but what they all have in common is the detailed high relief figures that line their exterior walls at about the midpoint of the elevation. Before the early 12th century, this kind of imagery was absent from the region's temples, and this style appears to have been developed to mark the dynasty's presence. Now, by and large, in Hoysala-style temples of the 12th century, outside the capital city, these figures share their space with elaborately sculpted representations of temple towers. Their walls are dynamically staggered, but not multi-pointed like the Hoysaleshvaras, and below the level of figures, we see a common pattern of unadorned base moldings rather than those sculptural friezes. The three-part elevation and multi-pointed ground plan only became more common among Hoysala-style temples outside the capital in the mid-13th century. One of the earliest dated temples to replicate this design outside Dora-Samudra is the Lakshmi Narasimha temple at Harnhali, built around 1234. And perhaps the most famous one today is the Keshava temple of Somanathapura. Built around 1268, it's one of the latest dated Hoysala temples. Standing within a walled courtyard, the Keshava temple has 3 sanctums, each one enshrining a different form of Vishnu. Impressive as these later Hoysala-style temples are, even they do not present quite the same visual experience that the Hoysaleshvara does. Besides being built on a smaller scale, in these mid-13th century temples, the effect of the sculptural wall is compromised by the separation of one figural composition from the next, by the stark corners that punctuate the edges of each figural block. Nonetheless, the construction of these temples would have demanded significant resources and artistic skills, and their associated inscriptions make it clear that their patrons and artists took great pride in them. It's not a far leap to surmise that the temple's larger communities took pride in them too, and that each unique temple would have brought a mark of distinction to its place. Before wrapping up, I want to look at one more group of temples and inscriptions that really drives home the idea that Hoysala period temples functioned as monuments for their cities as well as places of devotion. The place is Koravangala, a small village today, located about 30 kilometers southeast of Halebidu. In the 1160s to 70s, Koravangala saw a flurry of temple building activity that must have drastically changed its landscape. In short order, 3 brothers, all of them high-ranking officials in the court of the Hoysala king Narasimha I, constructed 3 temples in Koravangala, their birthplace. A finely carved inscription stele stands to the south of each temple, recording the details of that temple's foundation, as well as information about and extensive panegyrics of the brothers, their family, and their royal patron. So the oldest brother, named Govinda, sponsored the construction of Koravangala's Govindeshwara temple in 1160. This building appears rather modest in comparison to the temples we've been looking at so far, but for Koravangala at the time, it was monumental. Its inscription celebrates it as a beautifully constructed building with a strong base filled with jewel-like pillars and having a majesty comparable to the god Indra's majesty. Then a stone's throw away, the next brother, Nakarasa, built the Nakishvara temple. It isn't dated, but details in its inscription confirm that it was built just a few years later. Whereas the Govindeshwara temple has relatively plain walls with slender pilasters providing the only visual variation, the Nakishvara temple's exterior introduces images of temple towers, some with lotus or diamond motifs below them. It is conspicuously more elaborate than the Govindeshwara, and one wonders whether a little sibling rivalry might have been at play in the design, with Nakarasa wishing to upstage his older brother. Then the largest and most elaborate of Koravangala's temples, the Bhucheshwara, was built by the youngest brother, Bhujiraja, in about 100 meters to the south of the other 2. They're just getting better and better. Consecrated in 1173, on the occasion of the coronation of King Balala II, the Bhucheshwara temple is a prime example of the 12th century Hoysala style, with images of gods, goddesses, and other holy figures populating its walls. In addition to detailed images of temple towers, it upstages even the Nakishvara. In the span of just 13 years then, the town of Koravangala gained 3 stone temples, all of which would have been conspicuous additions to the landscape. What prompted these brothers to invest so heavily in Koravangala? They weren't shy about alluding to the expense. Beyond specifying the parameters of each grant, 2 of the inscriptions, Govinda's and Nakarasa's, praise the patrons for spending so much of their wealth on their temples. Nakarasa's inscription goes even further, suggesting a motivation for building in Koravangala that might have been at play for his brothers too. Within its lengthy panegyrics of its patron, the text says, quote, "The prudent Naki put all his acquired assets into stone in Koravangala so that his birthplace would become world famous," end quote. Nakarasa built this temple to put Koravangala on the map. He poured his savings into materials, labor, and an endowment, building in stone as if building in gold, the inscription says, because he knew, or at least he hoped, that an eye-catching stone temple like this would bring fame and prestige to his hometown. Surely the temple's sacred power contributed to this prestige too, but the text links the town's aspirational status most explicitly to the physical structure of the building. The temple was a monument for Koravangala. So from Belur to Halebidu, to Koravangala, Somanathapura, and other Hoysala cities and towns, artists and architects created one-of-a-kind temples for patrons who were willing and able to make the necessary investment. In their own ways, each of the visually prominent temples I've discussed today brought distinction to their cities and towns. Celebrated by their patrons and surely remembered by their visitors, they were urban monuments that helped shape the experience of each place. Thanks.